All right, with this demonstration, I'm going to talk about using the different selection tools in Photoshop. Now, making a selection in Photoshop is really essential for doing finer detail work. So far, we've been using the Move tool and selecting different layers and working with that. But let's say we want to cut out an element from one layer, such as our astronaut or our tree, or let's say we wanted to modify one element like the color of the sky or the American flag over here. Selection tools allow you to select different parts of your image and then edit those. So we're going to go through what the selection tools are, and then in later videos we'll talk about how we actually make those modifications. Making a good, strong selection is really key to understanding how Photoshop works, so it's really essential that you master these tools. Directly underneath the Move tool, we have the Marquee tool, which is also M on the keyboard. So if I tap M, it will switch to the Marquee tool. I'm using the rectangular Marquee tool right now. If I click and drag, it draws a small box, and I have these little marching dotted lines. We used to call them marching ants, but it's a little old-fashioned. This makes a selection area that I can then edit later. Again, we're going to get to that more in a future video. But for now, just know that you've selected this region. If I click and drag within that region, I can move that selection around. And if I draw a new box, it's going to erase my first selection. Now, whenever we make a selection, we can add on to that selection, and this applies to pretty much all of the tools we're going to be using today by holding down Shift. Whenever I hold down Shift, notice a small plus is added to my cursor, so this is without Shift, with Shift. And now if I draw a new box, it's going to add that to my selection. So now I'm selecting both this area and this area down here. Let's draw another box, and this time I'll have them intersect. See, and it grows that selection to encapsulate both of those areas. So as I'm dragging around, I'm selecting more regions. Now if I release Shift and drag a new box, it's done what it did before, where it erases my previous selection. Likewise, I can hold down Option on the Mac to subtract from a selection. On Windows, that's Alt, so I'd hold down the Alt key, and notice the little minus that appears. So a little minus appears whenever I hold down Alt or Option, and a little plus appears whenever I hold down Shift. So I can add to my selection and subtract from my selection. It may be helpful to look at this top options bar up here. This is default. Each time I select, I'm making a new selection. If I click this one, I'm adding to my selection. This one, I'm subtracting from my selection. And this is the intersection of my selection. So as you can see, whenever I'm holding down the different modifier keys, so I draw a square, I'm holding down Shift, notice it changes. Holding down Alt, it changes. So Shift, Alt, so you can see it switch back and forth. So it may be helpful as you're learning to look at those. Okay, so that's the rectangular Marquee tool. Under that shelf, so if I click and hold, we have other tools such as the Elliptical Marquee tool, which draws a circle. If I hold down Shift while I'm drawing, it will constrain it to a perfect circle rather than an elliptical. And just like the rectangular Marquee, if I hold down Shift after I've drawn a circle, I can add to it. If I hold down Alt or Option, I can subtract from it. Single row and single column work in a similar way. You can play around with those. Let's go to the Lasso tool, which is the next tool down. So that's L. The Lasso tool lets me draw a freeform shape and create a selection from that shape. And just like the rectangular Marquee tool, I can hold down Shift to add to that. I can hold down Alt or Option to subtract from that. So notice that the Lasso tool, as I draw a shape, whenever I release, it's going to connect the start point and the end point. So I release my click, and it draws a straight line. So if I draw a shape like this, whenever I release, it draws a straight line to the finish. Keep that in mind as you draw. So the lasso tool, let's try and use it to cut out this guy. It's pretty difficult to cut him out, at least easily. Let's go to the next lasso tool, the Polygonal Lasso tool. This works on a clicking system. So I click once to drop a point. I click again to drop another point. So this allows me to draw organic shapes. And then I can connect it back together by either getting near it or simply double clicking will connect it back to the original. And just like the other tools, if I hold down Shift, it will add. If I hold down Option or Alt, it will subtract. Now let's use the Magnetic Lasso tool. This is one of my favorite tools, but very hard to use if you're a beginner. I'm going to zoom in on this by holding down Alt or Option and scrolling. The Magnetic Lasso works on finding edges of subject matters. So this is a pretty defined edge, right? It's dark here, it's light here. The computer will have an easy time finding that. What I do is I click once. I'm not clicking and dragging, just clicking down once. And then as I move my mouse, notice it's drawing a little thin line and it is magnetized. It's locking it to that edge. So as long as I kind of roughly follow that edge, see? So as I'm following that edge, it's understanding to drop points. Now it just messed up a little bit and it does that. So I'm just going to try and draw around here. And if I don't have a solid edge, it may have a really hard time finding what I'm looking for. See, right there, it just kind of popped out of place. Eventually, whenever I bring it back, it'll connect. And of course, like the other tools, if I hold down Shift, I can add to the selection. If I hold down Alt, I can subtract from the selection. It's a very odd tool. It takes a lot of practice to get good at. Now let's talk about the Quick Selection tool. The Quick Selection tool is really interesting. It's like a brush tool. See how I have this little circle, looks like a brush? And you paint a selection. Now I adjust the size of it to match the interior of my selection, so I don't paint on the edge. So let's say I want to select this arm, just like how we did. I wouldn't go like this. Okay, I wouldn't try to paint the edge. I actually try to paint the interior. Now this is a really hard tool to use, really hard. I clicked once, and it basically just selected all of it. It tries to find an edge and selects it. It takes a lot of getting used to. I'm just clicking once, and it's adding to my selection. But it does a very good job of finding the edges. It's getting better and better. This is a relatively new tool. See, so that made a really nice selection. That pretty much selected the silhouette of my spaceman. But notice I didn't click on the edge. See, that wouldn't select it. I clicked on the interior. Practice with this tool. You can adjust its size up here. So I can make it really small or really large. Just play with it. And then we have the Magic Wand tool. Magic Wand tool takes a sample of whatever I click based on color and then selects things based on that. So if I click, let's say right here, it selects similar colors to what I clicked. So let's click this. See, so it selected this whole big region. If I click the interior, it selects that whole big region. But there's holes in this that you might have to come in and clean up, and I'll show you how to do that in a later video. But basically, these selections are based on color. This is really good if you have a large area that you're trying to select. For instance, the sky. By clicking the sky, it selected this whole region with just one click. Now I can adjust its tolerance here, so I can make it more or less sensitive. You can play with that on your own. There's also a contiguous setting. This is a very important setting right here. Right now, it's only selecting pixels that are contiguous. So whenever I click in here, it selects all the black pixels that it finds touching that black pixel. Let's uncheck this box and click again. Notice it selected all the black pixels throughout the image. Now this can be used to great effect to create some really cool stuff. But for now, I would usually leave that checked for what we're doing. those are really the basic selection tools. I want to quickly talk about some other things within selecting that are important. So if I draw a square here, to deselect, I can go up to select and then deselect, and that'll just remove my selection. It's very common for beginners to accidentally have like a really small selection, like maybe you accidentally selected a small area like that, and not be able to edit the rest of their image. So keep that in mind. You can go to select, deselect. I can also hit Command D for deselect, and that will deselect things. I can also do Control D on Windows. Let's say I make a selection, but I actually want to select the inverse of that. So what I've just selected is this square. I want to select everything else around it. I can go up to select and then inverse, and I'll select everything else. See the marching ants? Except for that. I'm going to hit Command D to deselect everything. There's other settings up in here, such as reselect, so this will reselect whatever you last had selected. There's select all, this will just select the whole image, and there's various reasons why you might do that we'll get into later, but just note that there's this select menu up here, and I would explore that and play around with that, see what's in there. So that was the Marquee tools, the Lasso tools, the Magic Wand, and the Quick Select tool.